Imagine standing on the ramparts of a great city. The year is 1453. The air is thick with smoke, the smell of sulfur, and the screams of a dying empire. You are in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the jewel of Christianity. But the walls are crumbling. The massive cannons of the Ottoman Turks are pounding the fortifications into dust. As the city falls, you see ships desperately trying to slip out of the harbor, fleeing west toward Italy. These ships are carrying frightened families, weeping for the homes they will never see again. But hidden in their chests, wrapped in protective cloth, they are carrying something else, something that will prove to be more explosive than gunpowder. They are carrying books. These aren't just any books. They are ancient manuscripts, philosophies of Plato, secrets of Hermes Trismegistus, and lost histories that the Western world has forgotten for centuries. We often look back at history and think of the Renaissance as a time of beautiful paintings and marble statues. We think of Michelangelo and Da Vinci. But there is a darker, stranger, and arguably more important story hiding in the shadows of those masterpieces. It is a story about how a geopolitical disaster, a massive refugee crisis, accidentally ignited the golden age of magic. Today, we are going to connect the dots between a fallen city, a banished people, and the rise of the Magus, the scholar-magician who dared to believe that humans could hack the code of the universe. To understand why this was such a cataclysmic shift, we have to look at what Europe was like before 1453. For centuries, Western intellectual life was largely locked inside a specific box. You had the church, you had orthodox dogma, and you had a very limited access to the deep wisdom of the ancient world. But then, Constantinople falls. This event wasn't just a military defeat, it was an intellectual evacuation. The scholars who fled the invasion didn't just bring their clothes, they brought their culture. They brought their religious, poetic, and historical writings. When these refugees landed on the shores of Italy, they sparked a culture shock. Suddenly, Italian scholars in cities like Florence and Bologna, the factories of new thinking, found themselves holding texts they had only heard rumors about. They were reading the original Greek works of classical authors that had been preserved in the East while the West was in the dark. Imagine the excitement in the air. It was like discovering a secret library that had been sealed for 1,000 years. These Italian thinkers began to devour these texts. They realized that the ancients had a completely different view of the cosmos, one where the boundaries between religion, science, and magic were not just blurred, they didn't exist at all. This refugee wave effectively widened the boundaries of academic debate overnight. It forced the West to look at its own beliefs through a new lens, a lens polished by the wisdom of ancient Greece and the mystique of the East. But this was just the first wave. A second tragedy was about to bring another essential ingredient to this magical cocktail. Fast forward nearly 40 years to 1492. In the history books, you know this as the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But in Spain, something horrific was happening. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued a decree forcing the expulsion of all Jewish people from their kingdom. Once again, thousands of people were forced to flee their homes. Many of these Jewish scholars, just like the Greeks before them, found their way to the relatively tolerant and intellectually hungry cities of Italy. And just like the Greeks, they brought their books. They brought the Hebrew wisdom literature, and specifically, the esoteric mystical tradition known as Kabbalah. Now, picture the scene in a Florentine plaza or a university hall in Bologna. You have Christian scholars, Greek refugees, and Jewish exiles all mingling together. You have the three great monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, whose texts were also being translated, and Judaism, colliding in a single intellectual space. To the advanced thinkers of the Renaissance, this convergence sparked a realization. They began to believe that these three religions, despite their wars and differences, must all share a common origin, a fundamental source of truth and wisdom that predated them all. They called this the Prisca Theologia, or the ancient theology. But ideas alone aren't enough to change the world. You need a delivery system. You need a way to spread the virus. And luckily, history had provided the perfect technology just a few decades earlier. Around 1440, the printing press with movable type was invented. Before this machine, a book of magic or philosophy was a rare treasure, hand-copied, expensive, and kept locked in a monastery or a prince's private library. But now, knowledge could be mass-produced. The printing press became the internet of the 15th century. It turned these new radical and sometimes heretical ideas into a fast-growing industry. Scholars didn't have to travel to a specific library to read a forbidden text. They could buy a copy. They could exchange ideas rapidly. The barriers to entry for studying the occult, hidden knowledge, were smashed to pieces. So, what happens when you combine Greek philosophy, Jewish Kabbalah, and Christian theology, and then supercharge it with the printing press? You get a new kind of human being. You get the Renaissance Magus. In the village, magic was the domain of the wise woman, the herbalist, or the person you went to for a love potion. But in the high towers of the universities and the palaces of the Medici, magic became something sophisticated. It became a quest for gnosis, deep knowledge, and exousia, authority and power. The most famous hub for this new high magic was the Platonic Academy in Florence, founded by Marsilio Ficino. These men called themselves Neoplatonists. They believed that the universe was not a cold, dead mechanism. They saw it as a living thing, suffused with spiritual entities. They believed in a great chain of being, where everything was connected. They believed that if you understood the secret sympathies of the universe, how a certain herb relates to a certain planet, or how a gemstone resonates with a specific star, you could manipulate reality. Think about the shift in mindset here. In the medieval world, if you were sick or in trouble, you prayed. You begged God for help. You were passive. But the Renaissance Magus was active. He wanted to understand the mechanism of God's creation so he could pull the levers himself. If God gave herbs medicinal properties, why shouldn't we use them? If God arranged the stars, why shouldn't we use their movements to improve our lives? There was no clear distinction anymore between theology, philosophy, and what we would call science. Casting a horoscope wasn't seen as superstition by these intellectuals. It was seen as a mathematical calculation of divine forces. Even the clergy, the priests and bishops, were casting horoscopes. But, as you can imagine, this freedom didn't last forever. The church began to realize that this new way of thinking was dangerous. When people start reading for themselves, when they start believing they can access divine power without a priest, the institution gets nervous. This intellectual explosion eventually fed into the Reformation. Men like Martin Luther began to challenge the Pope's authority, using the very same printing presses that spread magical texts to spread their revolutionary theology. The church struck back hard. They banned books. They branded critics as heretics. And ironically, as the Reformation split Europe, both Catholics and Protestants began to crack down on magic, viewing it as diabolical. But the genie was already out of the bottle. You couldn't unthink these thoughts. The tragedy of 1453 and the sorrow of 1492 had done their work. The refugees who fled with nothing but their lives and their libraries had successfully inoculated the West with a new spirit of inquiry. This era, which blurred the lines between the natural and the supernatural, laid the groundwork for the modern world. The Magus, who spent his nights in a laboratory trying to turn lead into gold or map the stars, was the ancestor of the modern scientist. They were the first ones to say, I can understand how this universe works and I can change it. So, the next time you hear about the Renaissance, look past the paintings. Look for the refugees in the background clutching their ancient scrolls. They are the ones who reminded the world that knowledge is power, and sometimes that power looks a lot like magic.